Okinawa, early May 1945. The sun has dropped behind low clouds over the Ryukyu Islands, leaving the Maeda Escarpment in a heavy, smoky twilight. This is the ground U.S. planners labeled part of Operation Iceberg, and the soldiers call simply Hacksaw Ridge, a cliff roughly 400 feet high, scarred by weeks of bombardment. Up on the plateau, near the village of Uraisomura, the battlefield has fallen strangely quiet between bursts of fire. The 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry Regiment of the 77th Infantry Division, has already been driven back once today, hit by Japanese artillery, mortars, and machine gun fire that left about 75 men lying wounded on the summit. Most of the survivors have already gone over the edge, clambering down frayed cargo nets toward safety. Below, medics and stretcher teams wait in the dark, staring up at the sheer wall of rock that rises hundreds of feet above them. They assume anyone still on top is dead. But one man hasn't come down. Desmond Thomas Doss, a slight, 26-year-old combat medic from Virginia, stands alone among the shell holes and bodies. He wears the same helmet and field gear as every other American soldier on Okinawa, except there is no rifle in his hands. Instead, he tightens his grip on a length of rope, murmurs a quiet prayer, and drags another wounded man toward the edge of the cliff. Tonight, on this narrow plateau above southern Okinawa, in a campaign that has already cost tens of thousands of lives, one unarmed medic is about to decide that retreat is not an option. Before we descend into the firestorm of Okinawa and the true story behind Hacksaw Ridge, a quick word for you watching this. If you're fascinated by real World War II history, then make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next documentary. The Road to Okinawa. To understand why one medic stood alone on a ridge in the dark, we have to pull back to the map table. By early 1945, the Pacific War had become a grinding, methodical advance toward Japan itself. The United States had already seized the Marshall and Mariana Islands, torn open the Philippines at Leyte, and paid in blood for Iwo Jima. Each step brought American bombers closer to the Japanese home islands, but the generals knew they still needed one more great foothold, Okinawa. Just 560 kilometers, about 350 miles, from Kyushu, Okinawa was the largest of the Ryukyu Islands and a natural springboard for any future invasion of mainland Japan. Its harbors and airfields, if captured, would give the U.S. a forward base for thousands of aircraft and warships. If it remained in Japanese hands, it could become a fortress blocking the final approach. The invasion was given a code name, Operation Iceberg. Under this plan, the U.S. 10th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., would land on Okinawa on April 1, 1945. 10th Army was enormous by Pacific standards, roughly 182,000 to 183,000 troops at the start of the campaign, including Army infantry divisions and Marine divisions, backed by more than 3,000 aircraft and a naval armada of battleships, carriers, cruisers, and destroyers. Facing them was the Japanese 32nd Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, with Fiery Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Isamu Cho at his side. Their forces included around 76,000 regular soldiers, plus tens of thousands of Okinawan conscripts and militia pressed into service. On paper, the Japanese were badly outgunned. But they had something else: time. They had used it to turn the southern third of Okinawa into a layered maze of concrete, tunnels, and firing positions. Japanese planners knew they could not stop the landing itself. At earlier battles, such as Tarawa and Saipan, attempts to defend the beaches had ended in disaster under naval gunfire. So for Okinawa, Ushijima and Cho developed a new concept: defense in depth, trading land for blood. Most of their strongest positions were pulled back into the hills and ridges of southern Okinawa, far from the beaches, where naval guns could not easily reach. When U.S. forces came ashore on L-Day, Easter Sunday, April 1, 1945, they were surprised by how little opposition they met. Some Marines joked that it felt like a training exercise. But as 10th Army advanced south toward the capital of Naha and the fortified Shuri Line, the true cost became clear. The southern half of the island was a natural fortress: ridges, ravines, limestone escarpments, and honeycombed hills. Japanese engineers had carved out extensive cave networks, with firing ports positioned to catch American attackers as they crested the high ground. They wired approaches with demolition charges, pre-registered artillery and mortar fire on every likely route, and prepared for protracted, close-in fighting. Every meter forward had to be earned, often more than once. U.S. units would fight for a hill all day, only to face a counterattack that same night. Heavy artillery and mortar barrages pinned down infantry in open ground. Flamethrowers and demolition teams became essential just to clear individual caves. Casualties mounted at a terrifying rate. By the time the battle ended in late June 1945, American forces had suffered roughly 48,000 battle casualties, including more than 12,000 killed or missing. Japanese military deaths exceeded 100,000, and when civilian losses were counted, tens of thousands of Okinawans killed by bombardment, starvation, and forced mass suicides, the total dead on the island approached 200,000 people. For U.S. planners, those numbers underscored two brutal facts. First, seizing Okinawa was essential if they wanted a staging ground for any invasion of Kyushu. Second, if one island could cost this much, an invasion of the Japanese home islands might demand casualties on a scale the American public had never seen. On the ground, though, men did not fight for abstract casualty forecasts. They fought ridge by ridge, escarpment by escarpment. One of those natural walls, running near the village of Maeda and guarding the approaches to the Shuri line, became a particular nightmare for the American infantry divisions sent against it. They called it the Maeda Escarpment. Soon, they would give it another name, Hacksaw Ridge, and send, among others, the men of the 77th Infantry Division to claw their way up its face. The men of the 77th and the wall called Hacksaw. By late April 1945, the long lines on the map had narrowed down to specific units and a specific cliff. One of those units was the 77th Infantry Division, the Statue of Liberty Division, a National Guard formation that had already fought its way across Guam and Leyte before being ordered to Okinawa. On the island, the 77th formed part of Ziv Corps under the U.S. 10th Army, rotating into some of the hardest sectors as the battle dragged south. Within that division, Private First Class Desmond Thomas Doss served as a company aide-man, a frontline medic, in the medical detachment, 307th Infantry Regiment, 77th Infantry Division. Born on February 7, 1919, in Lynchburg, Virginia, and raised in a devout Seventh-day Adventist family, Doss had grown up with a literal reading of the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." When he was drafted in April 1942, he refused not the uniform, but the weapon. He insisted on serving in combat as a non-combatant, accepting the role of medic rather than accepting a deferment or picking up a rifle. Before Okinawa, he had already seen what Pacific warfare meant. On Guam in July 1944 and Leyte later that year, Doss repeatedly exposed himself to fire to treat wounded men, actions that earned him 2 Bronze Stars for valor. Those earlier campaigns hardened both the 77th Division and its quiet medic, teaching them how quickly an apparently secure position could dissolve into chaos, and how thin the line between safe and exposed really was. On Okinawa, the division was committed to the Southern Front. According to the U.S. Army's official history of the battle, the 307th Infantry Regiment took over the sector, including the Maeda Escarpment, from elements of the 96th Infantry Division on April 29, 1945. The terrain they inherited was unlike anything on Guam's jungle ridges or Leyte's mountains. The Maeda Escarpment was a steep limestone barrier, a long, broken wall running across the approach to the Shuri line. Contemporary descriptions and later monument plaques at the site describe it as a cliff about 400 feet high, its vertical face rising abruptly from the lower ground below. American engineers and infantrymen had slung cargo nets up its side, turning the cliff into a precarious ladder under fire. On top lay a relatively flat plateau, but that plateau was ringed with trenches, riddled with caves, and zeroed in by Japanese mortars and machine guns. Japanese defenders of the 32nd Army had turned the escarpment into an integrated killing ground. Caves opened on reverse slopes, allowing machine gun teams to engage attackers who had just completed the climb. Covered firing positions were linked by tunnels, so units could survive bombardment and reappear after the shelling stopped. Night counterattacks probed weak points, trying to drive American units back off the top. For the infantry companies of the 307th, this meant every assault began with a climb, continued across exposed ground under pre-registered fire, and often ended with a scramble back down the same nets, dragging as many wounded as they could manage. For the medical detachment, it meant the official evacuation chain, from foxhole to aid station to field hospital, frequently broke down right at the top of the cliff. In that environment, personal choices mattered as much as formal doctrine. The decision of a single medic to move forward instead of back could mean the difference between a man dying alone in a shell hole or making it down to the surgeons waiting below. By the last days of April 1945, Desmond Doss, the unarmed, quietly stubborn medic from Lynchburg, and his comrades in the 307th Infantry Regiment stood at the base of this wall of rock and fire. Soon, the clash between his absolute refusal to kill and the Army's demand to take ground at any cost would come to a head on the plateau the soldiers had named Hacksaw Ridge. Next, we'll look at the key angles that shaped what happened there, from faith and tactics to leadership and sheer numbers. For most soldiers on Okinawa, courage meant how well you used your weapon. For Desmond Doss, it began with a decision not to carry one at all. He had been born on February 7, 1919, in Lynchburg, Virginia, and raised in a devout Seventh-day Adventist home where the words, "Thou shalt not kill," were taken literally. When he was drafted in April 1942, he refused a draft deferment. Instead, he insisted on serving, but only as a non-combatant. He would wear the uniform, go where the Army sent him, but he would not pick up a rifle. The Army classified him as a conscientious objector, a label he disliked. He preferred conscientious cooperator. Officially, he was assigned as a company aidman in the Medical Detachment, 307th Infantry Regiment, 77th Infantry Division. Unofficially, many of the men around him saw him as a problem. Training camp accounts describe attempts to have him removed from the unit, threats of court-martial, and blunt warnings that without a weapon he would only get himself and others killed. Yet his faith translated into something the Army could measure. On Guam in July 1944 and later that year, Doss repeatedly went into exposed areas to treat and evacuate wounded under fire, earning 2 Bronze Stars for valor before he ever saw Okinawa. The same religious conviction that forbade him to kill also forbade him to leave a wounded man behind if there was any chance to save him. That created a different kind of battlefield logic. For most soldiers, survival instinct pushed them toward cover when fire intensified. For Doss, the moral instinct pushed him toward the cries of the wounded instead. His crazy refusal to carry a weapon did not make him less willing to die. It redirected that willingness entirely into rescue. And it was this collision between institutional discipline and individual belief that would define his actions on Hacksaw Ridge. On paper, the U.S. Army Medical Department approached war in layers. An infantry regiment in World War II had a regimental medical detachment and was also supported by a divisional medical battalion, which included collecting and clearing companies to move casualties from the front to surgical teams in the rear. An article on Battlefield Medics notes that a collecting company could provide enough aid men for roughly 3 medics per rifle company, essentially 1 medic per platoon, plus litter teams to carry the wounded back. In doctrine, the flow was clear. Company aidman stabilizes the casualty, litter bearers move him to the battalion aid station, collecting company evacuates him to a clearing station, and from there to field or evacuation hospitals. It was a system designed for mobility and depth, assuming roads, cover, and enough space to set up aid stations out of the direct line of fire. The Maeda Escarpment broke that system at its first link. Here, the 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry had to climb roughly a 400-foot cliff on cargo nets just to reach the fighting. The moment the men crested the top, they were on an open plateau pre-registered for Japanese mortars and machine guns. There was no protected route to the rear, no easy way for litter teams to shuttle casualties down. Any wounded man who could not crawl to the edge of the cliff was effectively cut off from the formal chain of evacuation. Under those conditions, the company aidman was no longer just the first echelon of care. He was often the only echelon. When a Japanese counterattack on the escarpment inflicted approximately 75 casualties and drove the rest of the battalion back off the top, according to Doss's Medal of Honor citation, the entire medical system behind them might as well have been on another island. Causally, the doctrine had assumed that medics would fall back with their units, preserving trained personnel for future fights. On that night, the evacuation chain ran the opposite direction through one man. The breakdown of the design system on the escarpment made individual initiative, skill, and endurance, embodied in Doss, the only bridge between the wounded and survival. If the American medical plan broke on the cliff, it was because Japanese defensive doctrine was designed to make that happen. The defenders on Okinawa belonged to the Japanese 32nd Army, formed in March 1944 with about 77,000 regular troops, plus roughly 10,000 naval personnel and more than 40,000 Okinawan conscripts and laborers. Under General Mitsuru Ushijima and his aggressive chief of staff, Isamu Cho, the 32nd Army chose not to contest the beaches heavily. Instead, as post-war accounts by Operations Officer Colonel Hiramichi Yahara confirm, they dug into the hills of southern Okinawa to fight a prolonged battle of attrition. Their concept emphasized defense in depth, cave systems, reverse slope positions, and carefully camouflaged gun emplacements rather than open bonsai charges. On the Shuri line and its outworks, including the Maeda escarpment, artillery, mortars, and machine guns were pre-sighted on likely approach routes and assembly areas. The Maeda escarpment itself was both a natural and an engineered fortress, its limestone riddled with caves and firing ports that allowed Japanese troops to survive bombardment and then reman their weapons when American infantry appeared at close range. Hyperwar's official U.S. Army history notes that on April 29, 1945, the 307th Infantry of the 77th Division took over the Maeda sector from the 381st Infantry of the 96th Division, stepping straight into this fortified zone. Warfare History Network's account of Hell on Hacksaw Ridge describes how repeated American attempts to secure the top met with heavy counterfire and local counterattacks launched from these tunnel-connected positions. Causally, the Japanese doctrine aimed at one thing: maximize U.S. casualties for every yard of ground. By forcing American units to climb a bare cliff into pre-registered kill zones, the defenders drove casualty rates up and made evacuation almost impossible. The more effective their defensive scheme, the more wounded men were stranded on the plateau, beyond the reach of standard support. That is the environment in which a single unarmed medic could find dozens of men still alive after a failed assault, and also the environment that made staying behind to rescue them nearly suicidal. All these forces, personal faith, systemic medical doctrine, and deliberate Japanese defensive design, converged on the same few hundred meters of rock and dirt. Shaped by them, the men around DOS would soon reevaluate not just his usefulness, but their entire idea of what a real soldier looked like. Before Okinawa, many of the men who would later praise Desmond Doss tried to get rid of him. As a private in B Company, 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry Regiment, 77th Infantry Division, he stood out immediately in training, not for marksmanship, but for refusing to touch a weapon. Officers like Captain Jack Glover, who would later command elements of the 307th in the Pacific, came from a tradition where a rifle was as fundamental as a helmet. To them, a man who would not carry one looked like a liability in a rifle company that, at full strength, was supposed to field around 190 men armed and ready for close combat. Accounts collected after the war describe how some leaders tried to have Doss reassigned, arguing that his presence might endanger the unit. Court-martial was a real possibility. His refusal to obey direct orders to train with a weapon seemed, on the surface, like insubordination. Yet again and again, he held to a simple line: he would go wherever his company went, but he would not kill. Combat began to erode the skepticism. On Guam and Leyte, Doss exposed himself repeatedly to enemy fire to treat the wounded, actions that earned him 2 Bronze Stars before the 77th ever saw Okinawa. Leaders who had once seen him as a burden now had to reconcile their doubts with the statistical reality in their casualty reports. This unarmed medic was consistently bringing more men back alive. On the Maeda escarpment, that tension reached its peak. A rifle company whose doctrine assumed every man would contribute firepower instead discovered that its most valuable asset at a critical moment was a soldier who never fired a shot. The causal chain ran in the opposite direction of what officers expected. What they had once labeled cowardice or stubbornness became the very trait that kept him on the ridge when even seasoned combat leaders ordered a withdrawal. By the time the battle for Hacksaw Ridge was over, many of those same officers who had sought his removal would state openly that they would not have wanted to attack without him nearby. Doubt had turned into dependence, not because Doss changed, but because reality on the escarpment forced leadership to reevaluate what courage looked like. The legend of Hacksaw Ridge can feel almost abstract until you put hard numbers against human limits. A World War II U.S. Army rifle company, at authorized strength, consisted of 6 officers and roughly 187 enlisted men, organized into a headquarters and 4 platoons. In practice on Okinawa, combat attrition meant companies often went into action under strength. By the time the 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry took over the Maeda sector from a battered regiment of the 96th Division, one that had already suffered 1,021 casualties, including 536 on the Maeda escarpment over 4 days, they were stepping into a fight where units could lose a third of their effective strength in a single push. According to Doss's official Medal of Honor citation, when the 1st Battalion assaulted the 400-foot escarpment near Uresomura on the key day of fighting, they initially gained the summit, only to be hit by a heavy concentration of artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire that inflicted approximately 75 casualties and drove the survivors back off the ridge. In a company that might have mustered 130 to 180 men at that stage of the campaign, Losing 75 as killed or wounded in one action meant more than half the unit put out of the line in a matter of hours. Into that storm stepped a single medic. Doss's own post-war interviews suggest he initially thought he had saved perhaps 50 men during that night of rescues. Officers and fellow soldiers, counting the wounded who appeared at the bottom of the cliff and could name the medic who had dragged them there, argued for a higher figure. In the end, they compromised on 75 rescued, which is the number entered into the citation and later histories. From a purely quantitative perspective, that is extraordinary. One soldier, working alone under fire, accounted for returning a number of wounded roughly equivalent to half the effective strength of an understrength rifle company. Each body had to be found in the dark, treated, dragged, rigged in a rope sling, and lowered some 400 feet down an exposed escarpment. The physical strain, crawling, lifting, hauling, repeating this cycle for hours with minimal rest, pushed the human body to its limits long before the Japanese ever fired a shot. The numbers also reveal a deeper causal pattern. Japanese doctrine on the Maeda escarpment aimed to maximize U.S. casualties and sever the link between the wounded and their support system. The intense fire that created those 75 casualties also scattered and pinned down every other medic and litter team. In that artificially created vacuum, Doss's endurance and improvisation became the only functioning evacuation chain on the ridge. His later wounds, grenade shrapnel, a sniper's bullet that shattered his arm, a self-applied tourniquet and splint as he crawled some 300 yards to reach care, show that the same numbers game continued even when he became a casualty himself. At every stage, the arithmetic of firepower and manpower said he should have been just one more name in a casualty ledger. Instead, the ledger for B Company contained dozens of names that were not in the killed column because he kept going. All of these angles, faith, doctrine, leadership, and numbers, converged at a single moment on the plateau, when an ordered withdrawal met one man's decision to stay. Morning comes to Hacksaw Ridge like the lifting of a curtain, not into peace, but into clarity. It is April 29, 1945, near Uraisomura on Okinawa. 4 days, the 10th Army has been hammering the southern defenses of the Japanese 32nd Army as part of Operation Iceberg, trying to crack the Shuri Line. Now the task of taking one critical segment of that line, the Maeda Escarpment, has fallen to the 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry Regiment, 77th Infantry Division, the same battalion that carries on its roster a quiet medic named Desmond T. Doss. At the base of the escarpment, soldiers stare up at the problem in front of them. The wall of rock rises about 400 feet, a jagged limestone cliff the Americans have nicknamed Hacksaw Ridge. Engineers have slung cargo nets over the face, anchoring them where they can, turning the cliff into a crude ladder. Somewhere up there, invisible from below, are cave mouths, trenches, and firing ports cut into the plateau by Japanese defenders who have had months to prepare. The plan is simple on paper. Under cover of supporting fire, assault elements of the battalion will climb the nets, secure a foothold on the lip of the escarpment, push inland across the plateau, and link up with neighboring units to widen the breach. In reality, every step of that plan runs through ground the Japanese have already measured and registered. When the first waves begin the climb, the only sounds are the clink of gear against rock, the grunt of effort, the distant thump of artillery further down the line. For a few tense minutes, the escarpment is only a physical obstacle. Hands gripping rope, boots searching for purchase, men trying not to look down. At the top, they encounter the first line of Japanese positions, trenches, shallow pits, and cave entrances cut just back from the lip. The 1st Battalion attacks into them, using grenades and automatic weapons to clear holes, inching forward across the bare plateau. For a short time, it looks as if the plan might work. Rifle squads mark their progress by captured foxholes. Medics like Doss move from man to man, checking for wounds, pointing those who can still walk toward hastily marked casualty collection points near the edge. Then the counterfire begins. Japanese spotters, watching from concealed positions and cave openings, call down a heavy concentration of artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire on the newly gained summit, exactly as described later in Doss's Medal of Honor citation, which notes how enemy weapons crashed into them, inflicting approximately 75 casualties. Shell bursts walk across the plateau. Mortar rounds explode among groups of men who thought they were under cover. Machine guns rake the approaches, cutting down soldiers near the top of the nets. In minutes, the ground the battalion has just won becomes a killing field. Small knots of Americans try to hold on, but the combination of plunging artillery, accurate mortar fire, and enfilading machine gun bursts makes organized defense almost impossible. Japanese infantry, emerging from tunnel mouths and reverse slope caves, probe the edges of each foothold, throwing grenades, firing from concealed positions, then disappearing again before counterfire can land. On the plateau, the casualty count mounts with terrifying speed. Men who were upright moments before are suddenly lying still, or calling for medics, or dragging themselves toward the cliff edge trailing bandages and torn webbing. For the 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry, those 75 casualties in a single concentrated blast of fire represent a significant portion of their fighting strength, in effect, the combat power of an entire understrength rifle company taken out of action. Commanders face a harsh arithmetic. Stay on the plateau, and the battalion risks being shattered beyond repair in a matter of hours. Retreat, and they abandon the wounded scattered across the surface of Hacksaw Ridge, lying in shallow depressions and shell holes with Japanese patrols moving among them. The order goes out to withdraw. It moves not as a dramatic shout, but as a series of gestures, curses, and brief commands passed from squad leaders to their men. Those who can still move begin to fall back toward the edge, firing as they go, then slinging their weapons across their backs to grab the nets. Some try to carry the wounded. Most quickly realize that on this cliff, carrying another man down means risking 2 lives instead of 1. Below, on the lower ground, officers and medics see their comrades clambering back over the lip and begin to receive a trickle of wounded hauled or lowered down any way they can manage. To many watching from the bottom, it looks like a familiar pattern, an assault that has failed against a prepared position, leaving behind those too badly hit to move. But not everyone has gone down. Somewhere on the plateau, amid the shattered rock and drifting smoke, Private First Class Desmond T. Doss, Company Aidman of B Company, does not move toward the cliff. The same conviction that kept him from picking up a rifle now keeps him from joining the retreat. The evacuation chain has broken where the doctrine never imagined it could, at the very top of the ridge, and he understands that if he leaves, every man still breathing out there will be left to die. As the last organized groups disappear over the edge and the sound of boots on cargo nets fades, Doss turns away from the escape route and crawls back toward the cries he can still hear in the darkening smoke. Just one more. Smoke drifts low over the plateau as afternoon bleeds into evening. The organized American presence on top of Hacksaw Ridge has collapsed. The only movement now comes in small, desperate motions, a hand lifting for help, a figure crawling a few feet before collapsing again. Desmond Doss moves toward those sounds. He advances in short crawls, keeping his body as low as possible. Without a rifle, his hands are free, but his protection is limited to his helmet, a medic's bag, and faith that this is what he was meant to do. Somewhere out in the haze, Japanese soldiers are also moving, searching among the fallen for valuables, for signs of life, for opportunities to finish off the wounded. The medic works methodically. When he reaches the first casualty, he does what the army taught him to do. Check breathing, stop bleeding, apply a field dressing, administer morphine if needed. When possible, he pulls the wounded man into the shelter of a shell hole or depression before going to find the next. The official Medal of Honor citation would later note that he treated his injured comrades in the fire-swept area above the escarpment and dragged many of them to the edge of the cliff. It is one thing to treat a wound. It is another to evacuate a body over a sheer drop of roughly 400 feet with hostile troops nearby. Doss knows the nets are the obvious route, but hauling a limp, heavily wounded man down a swaying ladder of rope and knotted cargo webbing under fire would be nearly impossible. Instead, he improvises. Using a rope he has carried with him, he fashions a sling to secure each casualty, then positions the man at the very lip of the escarpment. There, with no one to help and no one even to watch, he begins lowering them, one by one, down the face of Hacksaw Ridge. Below, on the ground far under the cliff, soldiers and medics at first cannot understand what is happening. Men they had written off as lost begin to arrive at the base of the escarpment, swinging against the rock as they descend, calling out weakly. Stretcher teams scramble to catch each man as he reaches the bottom. Word spreads that someone is still up there, sending back the dead weight of the wounded against the pull of gravity. Up top, the work is slow and brutal. Each rescue begins with the same sequence: crawl, listen, risk exposure, treat, drag, rig, lower. Every drag across the rough ground tears at Doss's knees and elbows. Every lift and shift strains his back and shoulders. Each time he eases another body over the edge, he has to control the rope carefully enough that it does not jerk free or drop too fast, all while remaining exposed himself at the cliff line. The hours lengthen. The official citation describes his efforts as repeatedly braving enemy fire and repeatedly lowering men down the escarpment. Later accounts gathered from survivors suggest that this went on deep into the night, long after any organized unit remained on the plateau. Some of the wounded, he finds, are barely conscious. Others apologize for the trouble. Many assume he will leave them. Some urge him to go while he still can. After each rescue, Doss whispers a simple prayer, "Lord, help me get one more," before turning back into the dark. It is not part of any army field manual, but it forms the rhythm of his night. One more body, one more crawl, one more trip to the cliff. The numbers, when historians later tried to pin them down, seem almost impossible. Doss himself, in modest post-war recollections, thought he might have saved around 50 men that night. Officers in the 77th Infantry Division, comparing casualty lists with a long line of wounded who reached the bottom alive and could identify their rescuer, argued for a higher figure. The compromise they agreed upon, and the number recorded in his Medal of Honor citation, was 75 men rescued from the top of the ridge. To understand what that means, imagine an understrength rifle company of around 140 to 160 men going into battle. In the space of a few hours, one medic, working alone, removed the equivalent of roughly half that company's manpower from the killed or missing column and put them back into the category of wounded, evacuated. In the cold arithmetic of war, that is the difference between a unit that ceases to exist as a fighting force and one that can be rebuilt. And this was only the most concentrated episode in a longer pattern of risk. In the days that followed, during continued fighting on Okinawa, Doss would again expose himself to enemy fire to aid the wounded. On one occasion, he gave up his place on a litter to another casualty, walking instead, only to be struck by a Japanese grenade, which showered his legs with shrapnel. Rather than call another medic, he treated his own wounds and continued to help others. Later, a sniper's bullet shattered his arm. He improvised a splint from a rifle stock and crawled some 300 yards over rough ground to reach an aid station. By the time he was finally evacuated from the front, Desmond Doss's body was spent, marked by wounds that would affect him for the rest of his life. But the men whose lives had gone down that rope behind him carried something else from Hacksaw Ridge, the knowledge that on a night when doctrine failed and the situation made no sense, one unarmed medic had refused to leave them. When the sun rose again over the Maeda escarpment, the ridge was still contested ground. Japanese defenders still held positions. U.S. units would have to climb again. But the casualty lists for B Company, 307th Infantry, were already very different from what they would have been if Doss had followed the order to withdraw. Next, we'll see what happened after that night, how the ridge was finally taken, what it cost both sides, and how the army and the world tried to understand what one medic had done. Taking the ridge and counting the cost. When dawn came again to the Maeda escarpment, the ridge had not changed, but the men who would climb it next had heard what happened in the dark. In the days after Desmond Doss's night of rescues, the battle for Hacksaw Ridge continued with the same grinding, methodical violence that marked the rest of Operation Iceberg. The 77th Infantry Division and the 96th Deadeye Division rotated units through the Maeda sector, attacking, taking portions of the plateau, being driven back, and attacking again. Both divisions would earn the right, on later memorial plaques, to be listed as the formations that fought along the escarpment. U.S. Army histories, including Okinawa, the last battle from the center of military history, describe how the 77th's 307th Infantry Regiment gradually tightened its grip on the high ground through late April and early May 1945, while neighboring regiments battered their way forward along the Shuri Line. Warfare History Network's account of the Maeda fighting notes that by May 3rd, elements of the 307th had all but surrounded Hacksaw, with battalions on the crest, eastern end, and southern slopes of the escarpment. The price of those gains was measured in hundreds of casualties for single regiments over just a few days. The tactical outcome was never really in doubt. The United States had committed over 180,000 combat troops in 10th Army to Okinawa, supported by naval and air forces on a scale the Japanese 32nd Army, with roughly 76,000 soldiers and about 40,000 Okinawan conscripts, could not match for long. Firepower and logistics favored the Americans. What remained uncertain on the ridge was how much that inevitable victory would cost in lives. Here is where the rope over the cliff mattered. When the 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry, was driven off the escarpment by the heavy concentration of artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire that inflicted approximately 75 casualties, doctrine said the wounded left on top would almost certainly be written off. Instead, those same 75 men became the core of a very different ledger entry: wounded, evacuated, rather than killed or missing. At the scale of a corps or an army, that number barely ripples the charts. At the scale of a single rifle battalion, it is the difference between a shattered formation and one that can be rebuilt around a surviving cadre. The causal chain is stark. Japanese defensive design on the Maeda escarpment aimed to sever the link between the wounded and their support so that every man hit might as well be dead. Doss's actions partially restored that link. The battalion that climbed again in subsequent days did so with dozens of men alive who, by the logic of the terrain and the fire plan, should not have been there to tell the story. Beyond Hacksaw Ridge, the Battle of Okinawa ground on until late June. Modern syntheses, such as those by Encyclopedia Britannica and the National Museum of the Pacific War, estimate around 50,000 American battle casualties, roughly 12,000 to 12,500 killed or missing, and close to 200,000 total dead on all sides, including Japanese troops and Okinawan civilians. It was, by any measure, the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. To staff officers at 10th Army Headquarters, Hacksaw Ridge became one more named feature on situation maps, one more sector in after-action reports. But in the casualty rosters for B Company, 307th Infantry, the night Desmond Doss stayed on the plateau left a permanent gap where 75 additional death notices might have been. The Army still had to decide what to do with a man who had fought its hardest battles without ever firing a shot. Medal of Honor and the man behind the legend. When Desmond Doss finally left Okinawa, he did so not as a symbol, but as a badly wounded medic. His legs carried grenade fragments, his arm had been shattered by a sniper's bullet, his lungs already showed the early damage of tuberculosis that he likely contracted during his Pacific service. Over the next years he would spend more than 5 years in military hospitals, lose a lung and 5 ribs, and live with chronic health problems for the rest of his life. Yet even as he lay in wards far from the front, the Army was sorting through the reports from Hacksaw Ridge. Statements from officers and enlisted men of the 77th Infantry Division converged on the same picture: a lone medic who remained on top of the 400-foot Maeda escarpment, under fire, after the battalion withdrew, and who, over the course of hours, treated and lowered approximately 75 wounded men to safety. Investigators compared casualty lists, cross-checked dates, April 29 to May 21, 1945, near Uresomura, Okinawa, and consolidated the witness testimony into a formal recommendation for the nation's highest award for valor. On October 12, 1945, at the White House, President Harry S. Truman presented Desmond T. Doss with the Medal of Honor. In the terse language of the citation, the Army recorded not only the night on the ridge, but also his later actions on Okinawa, advancing under fire to rescue wounded, treating himself after being hit by a grenade, and crawling roughly 300 yards to safety with a shattered arm. He was the first man classified as a conscientious objector, more accurately, a non-combatant who refused to bear arms, ever to receive the Medal of Honor. In a war that had already produced famous names associated with aggressive leadership and lethal skill, the Army now publicly honored someone whose defining act was to save lives without taking any. After the ceremonies, Doss did not slide comfortably into the role of public hero. He returned to a much quieter existence, living first in Georgia and later in Alabama, working various jobs when his health allowed. Chronic respiratory problems and the loss of a lung limited his physical capacity. He lived for decades on a modest disability pension. Yet the story of Hacksaw Ridge did not fade. Veterans of the 307th Infantry Regiment told it to their families. Military historians and chaplains used it as a case study in moral courage, an example that complicated the usual categories of warrior and pacifist. Documentaries and books in the late 20th century revisited the Okinawa campaign and gave more space to the medic from Lynchburg whose rope had carried so many men down. By the time Desmond Doss died in 2006, aged 87, he had seen himself portrayed in films and interviews, but he consistently pushed attention away from his own name and back toward the men he had treated. In his own framing, he had simply done what his faith and his duty required, a personal logic that had collided with the industrial logic of modern war and, for one night on Hacksaw Ridge, produced a different outcome for 75 wounded soldiers. The ridge itself remained, its rocks scarred but its slopes gradually covered again by grass and trees. Memorials erected there in later years list the divisions that fought, the dates of the battle, and the toll in lives. Somewhere in that landscape of plaques and stone, visitors can still stand near the edge and look down, imagining, if they choose, a lone medic easing another man over the side into the dark. Stand at the edge of the Mayada escarpment today, and the first thing you notice is how quiet it is. The wind moves gently through the grass. Trees have crept back over slopes once stripped bare by artillery. Memorial stones mark the positions of the 77th and 96th Infantry Divisions, and plaques summarize, in a few lines, a battle that cost around 50,000 American casualties and nearly 200,000 dead on all sides during the fighting for Okinawa in the spring of 1945. From this distance, the numbers feel abstract, almost impossible to connect to the rock under your feet. It is when you look down, trying to imagine a rope swinging against this 400-foot cliff, a human figure straining to control the weight of another, that the scale of the war and the choices of one man begin to collide. The Battle of Okinawa was, in many ways, the pure expression of industrial-age warfare. Massed armies, thousands of aircraft, fleets of warships, casualty estimates calculated in the tens of thousands. The Japanese 32nd Army, with roughly 76,000 regular soldiers and tens of thousands of conscripts, had designed the southern ridges to grind down an attacker far stronger than itself. The U.S. 10th Army, with more than 180,000 combat troops, answered with overwhelming firepower and logistics. On paper, the outcome was a matter of tonnage, manpower, and time. Desmond Doss did not change that outcome. Okinawa still fell. The Shuri Line still broke. The war in the Pacific still moved on toward decisions in Tokyo and mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But within that vast machinery, his refusal to carry a weapon, and his decision to stay on the ridge when ordered to withdraw, created a pocket of resistance against the usual logic of battle. The United States awarded him the Medal of Honor, the first ever given to a man officially classified as a conscientious objector, precisely because his courage expressed itself in a direction the Army could not easily explain within its normal categories. Where most citations celebrate aggressive action against the enemy, his highlighted a night spent lowering 75 wounded comrades to safety instead of leaving them to die. In that sense, Hacksaw Ridge forces us to confront an uncomfortable paradox at the heart of modern war. The same system that depends on disciplined violence also relies, at critical moments, on individuals who choose a different path, who risk their lives not to take ground or destroy an enemy position, but simply to ensure that another human being does not die alone. The escarpment on Okinawa is now a place of memory rather than fire. But if you listen closely to the history written into its stone, you can still trace the path of one medic who climbed it without a weapon, stayed when others left, and turned a cliff designed to be a slaughterhouse into a narrow, fragile bridge between death and survival. One body, one rope, just one more at a time.